I want to capture the expansive feel of a redwood, to be enamored by the height, overwhelmed by the scale, and to find myself sitting amongst the trees. How can we think about bonsai? Is it just a potted plant, an obscure horticultural fascination? Although the work on each bonsai can vary widely, I approach each tree with the same considerations. As a living art, we place utmost respect and awareness to the health of the tree, and from that fundamental consideration, everything else can be drawn out. Okay, so I'm going to do a bit of VO here while I'm snipping away on this tree. We'll get into some techniques and details later, but it's important to provide some context first. To begin with, the unique quality in bonsai is that we are utilizing living trees. Of course, that can't be the lone descriptor. If that was the case, any potted plant or avenue of horticulture could be considered bonsai. So the expression of this art must delve deeper. In using this redwood as an example, one can say that one of my motivators in cultivating this as bonsai is for my tree to have the presence and feel of that of a tree in nature. I don't have a literal image in mind, but certainly it's possible to find a clump or grove of redwoods reminiscent of this bonsai. This is where things get challenging. Although my goal is to evoke the presence and scale of a larger tree in nature, the reality is that our bonsai is much smaller. So to achieve this goal, the trunk lines, branches, and foliage must proportionally reduce in size such that the bonsai maintains relative size scale. So we can start jumping down the rabbit hole of thinking, how big should I grow my branches? Can I control where I would like to grow them? How can I reduce the size proportionally smaller? These things are not necessarily hard to reason and rather follow a natural progression of logic. But as a general practice, I dissuade from this methodology of doing bonsai. You would end up with an infinitely long task list that can become convoluted and confusing. So we can reframe. Rather than thinking from our perspective alone, we should consider how the tree would like to grow. By default, something derived from nature that is concerned with survival will always seek the path of least resistance to grow. So the stronger parts grow stronger and the weaker parts grow weaker. In a tree, this is commonly associated with proximity and accessibility to sunlight. So these shoots I'm snipping now that are biased towards the outside of the canopy grow first, and by cutting them, I create an impetus for the trees to allocate strength to the weaker buds. Now, this may seem like common sense, but it's a fundamental and often overlooked tenet in bonsai. We should always strive to grow healthy trees and work on them with good awareness of how they can respond. You only have a goal of how you would like the tree to look and force the work. In a lesser scenario, branches could die, and at worst, you can kill the tree. So we reframe and understand our relationship to the bonsai is a partnership. We are coinciding how the tree is inclined to grow and with our aesthetic goals. In that overlap, we find bonsai technique. So let's jump and do a little technical cut before I blabber on. Okay, so a quick cut over to a bit of a technical blurb. I have this redwood branch I cut off as a sample here, and I wanted to go over the foliage characteristics and growing conditions that I'm undertaking this work under. First to start, redwoods have compound leaves, and that when we look at this branch, for example, we can see all these little leaflets coming off the stems. Although these leaflets may contain a bud, they're not guaranteed to have a bud. All this means is that if I take one of these branches and just kind of mindlessly cut it where I desire, it's not a sure thing that a bud pops right where I make this cut. Knowing that, there's these kind of two scenarios we can consider where that may happen. First is that we have young, new growing tissue. notice that on these shoots, the tips, as we kind of see here, on these little buds coming out around the ends, the color is a bit lighter green, right? So this is this kind of younger, elongating shoot on the tree. The growing tip, right, on plants is like this undifferentiated plant tissue, right? It's like the plant stem cell, so to speak. And when we remove, right, say this recently elongated growth before it has fully hardened off, right? So we cut this. This terminal end is able to make a new bud, right? And so we're able to do relatively shortcuts as needed, and we can generate a new bud from this growing tip. And I'll show an example of that in just a second. Another scenario is that we cut the tree to where there is an existing bud. And so although I said it may not contain a bud, right, on all these compound leaves, certainly it's possible that a strong branch may produce back buds on its own. So as we kind of look at these branches here on the end, notice how some of these tips independently did generate back buds. And so if I see these visible growing tips, I can confidently feel, okay, we can cut this, right, and these tips are going to take over, right? The scenario where perhaps we wouldn't want to cut the tree in kind of a more aggressive way is that on branches which are, say, weaker, perhaps not as strong, growing on the inside. So for example, we have this branch here, we can obviously tell the terminal tips are quite strong, but as we go further back, right, the relative elongation of these shoots are lower. And so for this example, I can see this shoot here, it's darker green, that's the old growth, and this extension here is this elongating bud that was produced in the last few weeks. If I cut at the tip, as I talked about, right, this newer, undifferentiated growth, it's going to make the bud. But say if I cut this branch, for example, back down here where the growth is older, well, that's not guaranteed, right? And I may end up having dieback. A scenario where I like to say you can brute force the cut is that if I cut a branch which overall is quite strong, right? Say we were assessing this entire branch as one piece, and I can say with all this terminal growth, it has quite a bit of vigor, and say if I just cut the branch in this manner, right? Maybe I want my growth to start earlier, I cut off this older foliage, what I had just mentioned not to cut, my experience on average has shown me that it still will make the buds. And so for a branch that is quite vigorous, we're able to brute force the cut, right? So typically on something that's smaller and weaker on the inside, not so much, but say in cutting the entire stem that has a huge amount of terminal growth, you can force the bud. Otherwise, when you cut redwoods, which have compound leaves, look for natural buds available on the tree, or you can go more in this kind of pinching methodology where I assess a branch tip, which is younger on the end, remove perhaps the majority of the new growth, right? And we're able to get that terminal tip to regrow and elongate. So if you can see that in the frame here, this is a young growing tip which I cut perhaps a few weeks ago. And trying to match that focus, and we can see those buds on the end, right? Those are those new buds which grew right on that terminal cut. So it's just kind of proving that if we do these cuts with a bit more awareness, right, or this younger as elongating growth, it will generate a new bud, right, and we're able to grow compact branches on the tree. Okay, so back to business on the snipping. All I've really talked about here is just some fundamental technique and a bit of the principle behind the work. Of course, the reality of this tree is that I'm not just starting from a single branch, and it's far beyond those preliminary stages. But just from that brief discussion, we can infer several things. First is that a branch that is growing strong will tolerate a brute force cut. That means if you have to elongate a branch, often far beyond the size of the desired silhouette in order to produce appropriate thickness, the avenue to cut back hard or to cut back shorter is always available to you. The early stages become incumbent upon the practitioner to determine what are they trying to achieve. I typically don't advise that there is a single superior aesthetic to achieve in any bonsai. Rather, for your desired aesthetic goal, are you able to convey it in a way that is convincing and not contrived? There's an aesthetic component to this, such as if I'm conveying a theme of environment, such as a wind-blown tree, all the trunks and the branches should be grown with that character of movement. There are more generic design principles as well, such as manipulating visual weight, the line of the tree, and so forth. I opted to introduce a theme of movement and directionality in my trunks, but to add some subtle variation with slight apical inclinations going back and forth. But that is to say, regardless of your aesthetic vision, to fulfill them within bonsai, we absolutely must understand and respect how a tree grows. On this redwood, I will continue the tedious but fulfilling process of this incremental work, allowing the tree to gain maturity in size scale as it ages. So there it is, here's the tree at this stage. There are still some younger branches that I need to elongate and thicken, and regions that require density to fill the space. As the branches get closer to maturity, I will start to thin the tree as well to reduce clutter and emphasize my primary branch structure. But all in all, the redwood is moving towards the right goal, and I'm excited to see it develop. I hope this was informative. In the future, I plan to show a wide variation of work, including other techniques with coniferous and deciduous material, wiring projects, and tree case studies. I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe, like the video, and share my content. Thank you for your support.